When I was a kid, one of the big events that I loved seeing reported on online was Spaceworld from Nintendo, because what it was a trade show where Nintendo showed off upcoming hardware, current hardware, games that were essentially in development or in some cases kept under wraps until Spaceworld debuted them. And so oftentimes you got to see some really interesting games pop up, like at the time Earthbound 64, which unfortunately never materialized. But in the year 2000, one game in particular that blew everybody away, myself included, was a unnamed tech demo showing off a potential Zelda sequel with the Gamecube hardware. And at that time period, you have to understand there was a massive transition from those somewhat primitive looking N64 graphics leaping into this more smooth, higher end looking Gamecube hardware. And when we saw Zelda debuting on that type of hardware, the crowds and the gaming press and everybody, myself included, my 10-year-old self, were going wild and were thinking that this was going to really push Zelda into a more refined and impressive looking direction. However, we never got to see that game materialize, and instead we got something very different. And in this video, I'm going to explore kind of the intricacies of this demo and if it was actually ever in development as a game or just a tech demo. So let's take a look. So during Spaceworld 2000, there were a bunch of different games announced, but really at this time period, these games were being sampled to audiences to show off the graphic capabilities of the upcoming Gamecube. And one of the big things that we saw with the Zelda Spaceworld 2000 trailer was it was in a lot of ways taking the art direction of Ocarina of Time or even Majora's Mask and upgrading it and basically making it look modern, or at that time period, next generation. You saw what I believe to be very good quality lighting effects, nice looking textures, particles, and animations that weren't possible with the N64 hardware. And this spectacle, or this tech demo, whatever you want to call it, it really painted a very interesting future for Zelda that looked like it was meshing the art style of Ocarina of Time, but almost the darkness of Majora's Mask, to give gamers something that was going to be basically upping the ante on what we had on N64. And at that time period, this generated a ton of hype for gamers, press, everybody who was interested in the Zelda ecosystem. And for gamers like me at that time, I was excited to see Zelda go into a more realistic looking style, a more realistic looking game. However, it turned out that behind the scenes, the Zelda developers, Aonuma for example, were not very excited by this direction. They felt like it was stagnant. They felt like this wasn't the type of game that they wanted to push on the new Gamecube hardware. And that's where a lot of fans became disappointed, because in the following year, we didn't see another trailer showing off the same realistic Zelda graphics. What we ended up seeing was a toon-shaded Zelda, or Zelda Wind Waker as we now know it, debuting. And in a lot of ways, this generated a lot of really upset fans and a lot of upset gamers. And I remember myself at that time feeling a little thrown off. Well, I wasn't upset. I felt like I was in some ways deceived. I felt like we were going to be getting this great realistic Zelda, and then all of a sudden we got something that for me looked kind of foreign for that series at that point in time, purely because we just came off of two really good looking 3D Zelda games on the N64. And one of the things that I became fascinated with after I accepted that this was the new direction that Zelda was going in was there actually any development that occurred with Zelda Spaceworld 2000? Was this actually a game that made its way into any sort of prototyping or world building or actual design beyond just a quick tech demo? And a lot of the details for this title are sparse. We don't have a ton of, developer documentation or even interviews that really elaborate on this beyond the fact that Aonuma states he wasn't really a fan of this style of Zelda. And where we start to see traces of this game that suggest that maybe there were some assets developed for it were actually Super Smash Bros. Melee. Now, the Link model that we have doesn't look one-to-one with this model, but it looks pretty close. It looks like the Link model they used for Melee could have actually been part of the world building, part of the character development for whatever incarnation of Zelda this was going to be. But most interestingly is that the Ganondorf model we see in the Spaceworld 2000 trailer looks very similar to both the trophy that we have in Smash Bros. Melee, as well as the character that you get to play as in Smash Bros. Melee, especially the sword. The sword is something that we see unique from this trailer pulled into Smash Bros. Melee, suggesting that Nintendo had plans to continue in this direction with this Zelda, and potentially even suggest that Nintendo got into some early design stages, character animation stages, that they were able to rip that from this yet to be developed or put into full-blown production Zelda, and they were able to use those assets in Smash Bros. Melee. And this is complete speculation beyond this, but if you look at even the level for Hyrule Castle, I wondered to myself if these were some assets that were slowly being built for this style of Zelda and were going to contribute to that world building of that style of Spaceworld 2000 Zelda, but really all we end up seeing is them using those leftover assets for the fighting levels or the level designs that you can see in this game versus what actually came out when it came to Wind Waker. So in other words, I wonder if some of these things were just scrapped leftovers that Nintendo decided to use, or Nintendo was going to continue the world building that we got a glimpse of in Melee and put that into full production for this style of Zelda. Again, we probably will never know. But this is an interesting gaming piece of history to me that I've always been fascinated by, because I remember as a kid being completely thrown off when I saw the toon cel-shaded direction Zelda was going in, and still hoping in the back of my mind we were going to get a bigger glimpse of this style of Zelda making its way to the Gamecube. And yes, we did ultimately get Twilight Princess, which for some fans in a lot of ways kind of filled that niche, but this was still something that, to me, it seems like it was alluded to a lot, in especially in Smash Bros. Melee, in terms of being something that was going to hit production or had hit production in the very, very, very early stages, but we unfortunately didn't get to see much beyond that.